Before we move on to our top story, let us bring you some breaking news. And I'm joined by Kate McCann. And Kate, the story's just breaking even as we speak.
It is. It's about the row over Nigel Farage's bank account. And we've been talking about this now for a week or so, about the fact that his account at Coutts was closed. And then after he filed a subject access request, he got more information about what he had understood to have gone on behind the scenes at Coutts. And he'd seen lots of information which mentioned Brexit, for example, and his sort of relationship with Russia. During that time, there has been some back and forth about how the BBC journalist who reported the story came by the story in the first place, and suggestions that Simon Jack had sat next to the boss of NatWest and Coutts at a dinner. Now, Alison Rose, who is the chief executive of the NatWest Group, has put out a statement in the last few minutes which seems to accept that she was the source of this story. She says, "I recognise that in my conversations with Simon Jack of the BBC, I made a serious error of judgment in discussing Mr Farage's relationship with the bank."
Hang on, just sharply in taking breath here. Because really, isn't there a duty of confidentiality apart from everything else?
Well, the statement goes on. She says, "Given the consequences of this, I would like to address the questions that have been raised and set out the substance of the conversations that took place." She says, "Believing it was public knowledge, I confirmed that Mr Farage was a Coutts customer and that he had been offered a NatWest bank account. Alongside this, I repeated what Mr Farage had already stated, that the bank saw this as a commercial decision. I would like to emphasise that in responding to Mr Jack's questions, I did not reveal any personal financial information about Mr Farage. In response to a general question about eligibility criteria required to bank with Coutts and NatWest, I said that guidance on both was publicly available on their websites. In doing so, I recognised that I left Mr Jack with the impression that the decision to close Mr Farage's accounts was solely a commercial one," which was, of course, what had originally been reported.
Yes, and turned out not to be true because we heard and saw all the things that the various high-ups at Coutts had written about Nigel Farage, all sorts of things about his political and ideological beliefs that they didn't approve of, and they said were not aligned with their ideals.
There's been a huge amount of pressure on Dame Allison Rose, who, as I said, is the boss of NatWest and Coutts, because of this suggestion that she had been the source. Simon Jack of the BBC apologised to Nigel Farage yesterday, but Mr Farage, subsequent to that apology, has gone on to say that he still feels that there are some very serious questions for Coutts about what happened here, because, of course, talking about somebody's banking information in whatever capacity is a breach of confidence on a fairly substantial level. And clearly, Dame Alison Rose is saying that she recognises that she made a serious error of judgment. We understand that the board of NatWest and Coutts retains full confidence in her. In reading the statement, my reading of it is that she's doing this in order to try and head off those questions about her remaining in that job, about Nigel Farage suggesting that she ought to step down, that actually the reality is she can no longer remain in that position. I mean, clearly, to have to admit that she did discuss private or banking details, she says not private information she believed was already public, but in whatever capacity, I mean, it's clearly something that you would not expect from the boss of a company like that.
Certainly not.
I mean, it's also problematic because, you know, as journalists, we don't reveal our sources. The fact that Simon Jack of the BBC had come under so much pressure to reveal his own source and hadn't done so, you know, there's probably an element of that in what's going on here too. But, I mean, I think it's safe to say that from Nigel Farage's perspective, this is not the end of the matter, and no doubt we'll hear more from him in the next hour or so.
I also think it's safe to say that when people say confidential sources, most people would not imagine that would be the chairman of the company. You might think it would be somebody somewhere in the ranks, probably the lower ranks, who by hook or by crook or for some administrative reason is in possession of more information than they really ought to be a party to. And somebody somewhere in the lower echelons of the company has let something slip, possibly for money, maybe for revenge or for whatever reason. But you wouldn't expect the source or the leak to be a dame of the British Empire and the chairman of a company. I mean, you just really would not think that, would you?
You wouldn't, although, you know, those kind of high-level conversations do happen all the time. And evidently from that statement that I've just read out, Dame Alison Rose believes she was confirming details that were already in the public domain. Now, the job of a journalist is to make somebody believe that they're not giving you the information that you would like them to give you in order to sort of get more out of them as a source than you can. I suppose that's one of the ways that journalism happens, but I think the reality here is that somebody in that position would understand that a public figure like Nigel Farage discussing any of his banking details, whether you believe they were in the public domain or not, would not be something expected of you as somebody in that role, particularly when you are talking to a journalist of such quality as Simon Jack, you know, somebody who is reporting daily in a very, very high-profile role. That, though, is almost a sideshow to the fact that there are still these questions about Coutts. And remember, Dame Alison Rose did confirm last week that Coutts was having an investigation into its own internal practices off the back of the fact that Nigel Farage's account was closed, not just for commercial reasons, although worth repeating that the bank says it never closes accounts without a very good reason, and it does look long and hard at doing it. But all of the stuff that he then discovered when he was given these papers about his political views and about the reputational impact on the bank of having him as a customer, I think for Nigel Farage is the really worrying element.
And also, well worth pointing out that something may well be in the public domain, but it doesn't have the ratifying seal of approval of the eminent CEO of the company, the chairman of the company. It's totally different that something's lurking about in the public domain, but when the chairman talks about it in whatever way she infers or implies that she did or didn't talk about it to Simon Jack, that gives a whole new level of, I suppose, heft and weight to the story and takes it on a completely different direction. So whether it was or wasn't in the public domain, which actually it really wasn't, not in the way that she's implying it was, this isn't right anyway, is it?
Well, I think what she's suggesting there is that the information about when you would hold a Coutts account is in the public domain. So we all know now, after reading about the story and
how
listening,
much money you need to
how
have.
much money you
£3
need to
million
have,
right?
and et cetera. And you need to have a certain amount of money in the bank and loans and all those kind of things. So I think what she seems to be saying in this statement is that she had made clear to Simon Jack that the information about what you would need to do to bank with Coutts was in the public domain. And by doing that, she'd given the impression, now we know not entirely completely accurately, that the account was closed because of that reason, which is, of course, what the BBC initially reported in their story. And, you know, there have been all kinds of questions about the BBC's motivation. To go back to your point, no, if the chief executive of a company leads you to that impression, you would be fairly confident in reporting it, rightly or wrongly. Evidently, it was not the full story, though, and Nigel Farage clearly went back, found out more information, reported it, and then we've now had this row which led to the government reinvestigating and Coutts reinvestigating itself. But I think that the pressure on Dame Alison Rose now in that top job will be significant from those, including Nigel Farage, who feel that, you know, this is not the end of the matter.
Fascinating story, isn't it? Absolutely fascinating. I think one of the most fascinating elements of the coverage that we have given it on this programme was when Richard Tice, chairman of the Reform Party, or founder of the Reform Party, said it is a human right to have a bank account. It's a basic human right, like food, water, liberty, free speech. You have to be allowed a bank account. I think that gave people food for thought. Many people thought he was right. Some people thought he was wrong. But it certainly was a very interesting view. I think this has been a hell of a discussion.